Sons of Devils by Alex R. Oliver, Chapter 15, in which Zayd captures an abominable gang of traitors. You see how plausible he becomes. Nabi tugged Zayd aside into an alcove between the first and second courts, where the sobbing and chattering of the petitioners, queuing to see one official or another, would cover his urgent words. He begins to sound like a sane man. Those officials who might have backed me up in a movement to replace him with one of his brothers when he was giggling and shouting at the walls will not do so now the evil influence has sunk so far beneath his skin it is no longer visible. And we are running out of live brothers who could take his place. Zayd had reached the point where he did not believe he could respond to any more urgency. An almost comforting calm had replaced too long a strain. He brought the folded parchment of his charm out from where it was tucked into his sash. Haji, if you think it wise, I have prepared this, which is the first of the protections I spoke about in the divan. This will protect its bearer from the influence of the long-toothed demons. I give it to you to dispose of wherever you think fit. But it has taken me and my household the whole night to come up with this one thing. I have flying carpets to invent and demons to slaughter. I do not think I can do both of those and come up with a cure for divine madness too. You have as many staff as you choose to recruit, and all my fortune behind you. Nabi took the charm in both hands as though it was heavy, tucked it into his own garments with a thoughtful look. That is I am very grateful, Zayd remembered to say at the last moment. It is very welcome, and I'm grateful, Zayd remembered to say at the last moment. But I need mages, and Istanbul simply doesn't have them. My son, the Grand Mufti said solemnly, Istanbul has you. Perhaps you do not yet trust in yourself. And if that is the case, then you must trust in Allah, who has placed you, and only you, here at the very moment that you are needed. A solution will come to you. Do not doubt it, as I do not doubt you. He pressed a splayed hand over the magic square, his gaze a little less troubled now, as though he had made a decision. Thank you for this. I know exactly to whom I must give it. Will you be able to make more? I have people working on it right now, though they must sleep at some point today. He forestalled Nabi's objection with a raised hand. If they are tired, their fingers cramp, and their eyes blur, and the magic fails, it is being done as fast as it can be done. Nabi gave him a warm smile, a look of almost childish trust that made Zayd feel absolved of his many mistakes. Of course it is. May God strengthen your arm. He retreated back to his affairs of state with a solemn gait. Nabi, Zayd thought, uncharitably, probably only faced a future of being garroted with a silken bowstring, quick, relatively painless, and dignified. Zayd, however, Zayd had no other option than to perform miracles, because he would not let his family down. He set his weary mind to the task with determination. How to fight demons? The first step, he supposed, was to find out where they had suddenly come from. If there was an enchanted lamp or a cursed book open letting them out, it could be shut, surely. Over the course of his interview with the Sultan, the streets had been cleared of dead bodies. He found a Janissary fireman with the last of the crop draped over his shoulder, and followed him to where they were laid out in rows in the courtyard of the Suleymaniye. Swathed women and weeping men were pacing the rows, trying to find their relatives, so that they could be decently washed and shrouded, and buried as soon as possible. Joining the lines of relatives, Zayd walked among the corpses. 12 long lines with 10 bodies in each, all of them white and wrinkled, not even swelling up properly, but looking like grapes well on their way to raisinhood. He checked mouth and hands, not quite sure what he was looking for until he found it. A fist tightened in rigor mortis around a handful of soft, dark fur. The little tendrils of it had clumped together, wet with what he at first assumed was blood, but when he teased it out, it smelled more like seaweed. Picking the fur out of the corpse's hand, he sent a messenger boy to find Monique bint Marise, hurried to his little stall to meet her there. She arrived carrying some kind of pilau wrapped in flatbread, which, unable to eat without lowering the veil over her mouth and nose, she offered to him. He took it just to hold, feeling it go cold by degrees, and offered her the fur in exchange. "Can you find out where this came from? I know you normally find things for people, but can you find people from their things?" I can try," she said. And cupping it in both hands, she raised it to her forehead, where the slope of her square headdress revealed a thin sliver of skin above her eyes. She was silent for a long time, and Zayd ate the pilau because it was a shame to waste it by allowing it to go cold. "Water, yes, I think..." Half dreaming, half vibrating like a pointer dog, she turned on her heel and began to walk away, her hands still pressed to her forehead. He followed as silently as he could, aware that all around him the city too was hushed and grim. Down from Topkapi, down toward the Golden Horn she led him, out into dockyards turned tent city turned army camp, where the men who watched them pass had evil-toned eyes over high cheekbones, surly slave-like expressions, on faces pale as curds. They neither challenged nor acknowledged Zayd, as Monique led him down to the harbour's edge and pointed out, up the Bosphorus, to where the fleets of hired merchant vessels were still plying up and down, bringing in the Sultan's Baltic troops. "It came from out there, somewhere out there," she said, in a trance-like voice, then shook herself and focused on him, lowering her hands. "But I don't know where its owner went after he and it parted ways. I'm not used to it this way round. Objects stay still where they're left, normally. It's easier to take people to them." Zayd took out a handful of the sequins Nabi had given him and tipped them into her palm, turning his back to shield the gesture from the foreigner's unsettling glares. He dreaded the thought of having to question them. Could any of them even speak his language? "This is good," he said, nevertheless, feeling the need to get her out of the situation fast. On an intellectual level, since she was French herself originally, he supposed these men were more her kin than he was. But intellect didn't come into it. She was a well-behaved, pious Muslim woman, and he didn't like the way the infidels looked at her. "Thank you. Let me walk you back a little way." Creases sprang into being by her eyes. She must be smiling. "Thank you. You are very generous. I did take your lunch." By the time he had taken her away from the armies, he had thought of a better way to proceed than to accost unwilling vassal Yahyas. He returned instead with Haji Nabi's pass in hand to speak to the Harbour Master. The Harbour Master, Ubayd bin Turhan, brought Zayd into his own house and sat with him in the central courtyard, where a fountain cooled the air and doves hooted softly around a white dovecot of marble. There were tangerines swelling on the trees in all four corners of the garden, and the air was perfumed with them. "I do remember something out of the ordinary happening," he replied to Zayd's question. "Only last night I was woken and dragged out of my bed by the servants of one of the foreign lords." Seesawing a hand above his tea, making the steam billow, he snorted. "This is less unusual than you might think. They are all very self-important, these distant warriors." "No, what was unusual about it was that I didn't mind." He offered Zayd a platter on which small squares of baklava and 3 different Flavours of Turkish delight were arranged like slightly dusty jewels, green and pink and yellow. He was as round as the dome of his turban, like a small world on legs. His face was soft in the manner of fat men, but his eyes were shrewd. "It's more unusual that they even got that far," he said, rethinking. "Normally a guard or a servant would catch them at the door and turn them away until morning. These two walked straight into the private rooms, and rather than have them thrown into a cell to await my pleasure, I found myself doing as they asked." It was a kind of mental compulsion. Zayd closed his hand in reflex around the bead of his necklace. "You felt the press of another will on your own, and it moved you like a puppet." No. Ubayd licked lemon jelly from his fingers. "Nothing like that. I would have found someone to report such a thing to. This was altogether subtler." From the fountain in the middle of the court, 4 shallow rills of water in perfectly white, crisply sculpted channels flowed out to join a circle that ran around the whole garden like a moat. They reflected the sky in blazing bands of silver, until Ubayd put his fingers in the nearest and broke up the surface into dark ripples and snatches of tangerine. Zayd considered another question, but decided it would be wiser simply to allow his host to tell the story at his own pace. "I woke and found 2 of them in the room with me, unarmed, innocent-looking. One was a young man of great beauty, golden-haired, but too skinny. He was the one who spoke our language. It was the other who was so extraordinary. A very plain youth, with a birthmark here." He indicated the side of his chin, above and below his jaw. Despite his looks, there was something very likeable about him. "I woke and I don't understand it myself. I felt I was in the presence of a very old friend who I had long missed, who had come back unexpectedly. I was extremely happy to see him." He sipped at his tea and picked a flake of pistachio nut out of a rose-flavoured sweet. "Now I look back on it, I don't understand how I could have felt this. But at the time it seemed only natural to put myself out for him as you would for a brother. When they told me that their lord had brought his army, and I must come and make a record of this at once, even though it was still before dawn, I made no protest. I dressed and went with them. And it was as they said. It was, a lord all in white, with his son and his troops." He shivered theatrically, bunching his shoulders up by his ears. "All of them as cold as their country, as though they are made out of snow." "You told no one?" Ubayd shifted on his cushions, drawing his legs in, making himself small. "It did not seem strange until you questioned me about it. I found the young man's ignorance and enthusiasm charming. There seemed no harm in a wish to report for duty immediately. An excess of zeal, perhaps, but it felt churlish to discourage such a thing in a time of war." He gave a soft, uncertain laugh. "Now I've said as much, it becomes perfectly innocent again in my memory." He drew a thumb around his fingers as if smoothing them down. "It was a strange thing to happen, wasn't it? I do not imagine that." "It was," Zayd reassured him. "You checked them as normal and housed their lord in a place he could be contacted when needed?" "I did. May I see the record?" "Of course." The apartment to which Ubayd directed him was part of a block of many small rooms, some with kitchens, some without. The front faced onto the parade square, the rear onto a small canal that came up from the harbour and was dotted all over with small boats. Large doors well above head height, and the remnants of platforms with wooden cranes, told Zayd that the place had once been a warehouse, sold and repurposed when its original owner proved unlucky at trade. Entering through the street door, past the grill behind which the landlady sat, all in black and smoking a pipe, gave him a view only of stairs and corridors punctuated by locked doors. He knocked at the right-hand door. Wished he hadn't. Wished he'd brought troops to back him up. Was tremendously relieved when no one answered, and then he reconsidered his plan. Just barging in and asking questions of a man who presumably could control demons did not seem like a good survival strategy. He hurried back out again, walked around the building and considered the canal behind. Better to find out what he could by observation. Then, if he needed to intervene, he could come back with an army. But would there be anything to see in the daytime? The demons which had plagued his home last night had disappeared when the sun rose. Ubayd had been hustled out of bed to make an inspection in the darkness. Surely they would not have called attention to themselves in such a way if their business could have been done an hour later in daylight. No, whatever was happening only happened at night, so he should wait until nightfall to act. After the weary night he had endured, Zayd was glad enough to go back to Ubayd's house, tell him his intentions and snatch 4 hours of sleep before sunset. He felt slightly better for it afterwards, less disarticulated, less dazed. Once the sun had fallen, Zayd commandeered one of the little boats which were moored on the canal. Stepping down into it, feeling the queasy bounce, he hunted round for oars and managed to awkwardly paddle it up to the lowest of the landing platforms. Tying the rowing boat off there, he reached up and caught the edge of the landing firmly enough to swing himself up onto it. From there he could do the same for the platform above. And from there it was only a little shimmy across a hand-width of window ledge, face pressed against the wall, hands outstretched like those of a drowning man floating in a pool, to reach the landing that protruded from the back of the foreigner's apartment. This had once been one of the better entrances. A doorway large enough for a small cart to pass through was closed by 2 oak doors, bolted and locked in the middle. He pried at the lock for a long moment, cursing the fact that he had not thought to bring a hacksaw. The iron itself, though rusted into one mass, was solid and immovable. But the wood of the door around it had softened through the metal's repeated shrinking and expanding. If he clawed at it, his fingernails sank in deep. He took the dagger from his sash and dug around the lock plate. Punk wood flaked away easily, and though it grew harder the deeper he dug, the good layer was thin enough to be jabbed through. It took perhaps an hour's work to cut around the lock plate enough so that he could open one door, leaving lock and plate embedded in the other. He was very glad to duck his head through and see a small anteroom, thick with dust, and hung with mouldy ropes. He eased his way inside at once, full of guilt for his housebreaking. He touched Nabby's parchment in his breast to feel the reassuring crinkle of it, which assured anyone who might have seen that he was a man with a mission and no mere criminal. Nothing suspicious lurked in this room. A long rope, still with metal hook and winch attached, lay coiled in dust that looked as if it had not been disturbed for half a century. A ladder leaned against one wall, and a pair of empty buckets huddled by another. The other side of the room, a smaller pair of double doors, also stood locked, but these were locked on the other side. From where he stood he could only see the pins, and they were solid, bright, and heavy painted wood. There was, however, a gap between the doors. He could see nothing through it at first but darkness. But as he was wondering if this was as unsuccessful as the front attack, a door opened in the far wall, and a glow came in, sweeping round the room, showing it to Zayd's watching eye. It was a heavily shuttered room, the window covered with a carpet, fine carpets on the walls. A divan of cushions to the left supported an open book and one of the distinctive Balkan hats. The glow came from a lantern in the hand of a young woman whose turned face made Zayd catch his breath. Her skin was marked red, as if scorched, from the throat to the lower cheek. He looked again more carefully. She had a long, harsh face, masculine enough. She was tall, and even in her corseted bodice wide across the shoulders. He could see her passing as a youth, with a great deal more success than she would ever have in emulating a beauty. Her uncovered face made Zayd uncomfortably aware that he was trespassing across the boundaries of decency. He was about to retreat from his peek-hole when she took a little cone of paper, just like the one he had bought the arsenic in, out of her skirt pocket. Looking nervously around herself, she reached into one of the cases that lined the wall and pulled out a bottle of wine, from which she carefully removed the cork. Pouring in a stream of white powder, she shook the mixture, recorked it, and sealed it with wax from a writing set melted over the candle of her lantern. Her expression was exactly that which Zayd's mother used when trying a recipe new to her, or combining two magic squares to create an effect. A kind of detached, scholarly interest. Zayd blamed that for the length of time it took him to realise that he was witnessing the planning of a murder. As she hid the bottle behind one of the seat cushions, as soon as the evidence passed out of her hands, Zayd doubted he had seen it at all. She was very plain, yes, but Ubayd was right to think she was inherently trustworthy. He could not have seen what he thought he'd seen. He should laugh at himself, really, for such a ridiculous notion. Anyone could see she was not that kind of a woman. There were two somewhat mildewed sacks in the barrels. It must have been a spice warehouse once, for the sacks were streaked with bright yellow and stank of stale turmeric. He picked them out to cover himself with, to keep warm while he waited for something more suspicious to happen. But for a long time it was simply the woman sitting by her concealed bottle and calmly reading a book. It was full dark and cold outside by the time the door slammed open again, and several people pushed through, arguing. The first, a dark-haired man in an indigo coat, was saying, "I didn't agree with this slaughter." Zayd sat up so quickly his head reeled. More folk came in behind, one of whom was surely the slender, beautiful boy Ubayd had mentioned. One was a radiant, unveiled woman in a gorgeous dress and silver headdress, all grubby with soil. And the other was the sort of loosely turbaned, curly-haired urchin that could be seen at any hammer or marketplace, teasing the older men and running away, interchangeable with any other loose-limbed, bright-eyed beggar boy. Last of all came an elder, whose white hair and long white beard were as besmirched with brown stains as his white clothes. Patches of his jacket gleamed like snow through the filth, and his belt gleamed like silver. His eyes had something of the same cold metallic glitter as he turned to look at the speaker. "I thought this was exactly what you wanted, to let us loose on the Turks." The creeping cold that prickled the back of Zayd's neck drove deeper, extended spines and poisoned his blood. This atrocity of dead civilians was what the foreign boyar had intended? It was clear the younger man was as noble as his elder. The quality of his garments was as good. His belt was studded with golden plaques, and his scabbard mountings were chased all over with gilding. He must be the older man's son. The family resemblance was striking, as was the way both of them expressed anger with icy rigidity and tension, their words snarled rather than shouted. "I thought you would have the decency to attack the Turks' armies, to take out the Sultan and the Janissaries and the sailors, not beggars and perfume salesmen and children. You were the one who taught me that warriors do not waste their anger on the sheep of the kingdom, that there is nothing left to rule if one does not leave the shepherds and the farmers untouched. You taught me that. What changed?" Zayd might have laughed if he had not been trembling with indignation. It was well known that no one could trust a Dacian. The Romans had known it before the Ottomans, little barbarian lords of little barbarian kingdoms, who only ever gave loyalty to themselves. It shouldn't surprise him now to see it played out in the present, but it did. He felt a stirring of something hot at the ingratitude, and the endless rejection of a hand held out to them, again and again, offering protection and civilization and brotherhood in the greatest empire of the world. Children of these infidels had become viziers in the past, had taken all the power and prestige possible for any man who was not sultan, taken in and cherished and rewarded like one of our own, and still they turn in the hand and bite like snakes. What's changed, father? Some of the same indignation reflected in the noble's tone. Zayd knelt on his hands, which seemed likely to punch something without his permission and give him away. We were hungry. No, that didn't. Zayd's mundane anger found a little chink in the lake bed of his soul, washed through into deeper caverns. Those brown stains on the older man's white clothes, the red spatters on that little doll of a woman like jewels sewn in her headdress, and the memory of his neighbour's children lying in a heap like unfolded flannels, new cuts on their hands that didn't bleed, bodies in the mosque laid out in lines as though a Tatar army had been through, taking what they pleased and destroying the rest. You were one of Vlad Dracul's men, father. You never stopped telling me how the common folk loved him, how the Pope blessed him, how he fought the Turks in a holy crusade, an upright man, fair if harsh. He would not have touched boys in their schools, mothers in their nurseries. How odd it was to see something of his own fury, his own horror, on the face of the very enemy responsible for the atrocity. There was even a choke in the last sentence, as though the words had to be driven out around angry tears. Father, mother, I thought you were more than monsters. He turned away, covering his face with his hand. The others had already cast their gazes down, and for the ringleaders of a successful plot, the expressions were funereal, tight-mouthed, grim and sad. No one in the room seemed capable of looking at one another. Radu, the white elder, reached out and touched his son's shoulder. It twitched as if to shake the gesture off. There was no time when we arrived for strategy. We had been fasting for too long, and we were forced to find food and shelter at once. From now on, to please you, I promise that things will be different. You fret too much, darling. The blue-clad woman had a piping, girlish voice to go with her fresh-faced beauty, but her smile was edged with the same ice that lurked in the elder's eyes. What does it matter who dies? They're not our people. If they're busy mourning their children and their mothers, they will not be waging war. Oh, they will. Zayd was no soldier. He had no sword, but he had a dagger stuffed into his sash, its hilt just protruding from the red linen. The British were plotting with the Dacians to win the war with an army of monsters. He drew his knife, burning with the need to fight, his hands shaking with it. The blade made a snick noise as the point withdrawing clicked against the protective mouthguard of the sheath, and the heads of both the soiled grandees turned toward the sound as lions turn toward an injured antelope. Zayd's fire turned instantly to ice, the swift change making him feel brittle. It occurred to him late that if he charged into the room bearing only a dagger and the wrath of Allah, he would face 2, perhaps 3 men with swords, discounting the woman bathed in blood and the one who had posed last night as a cavalryman. That encounter would not go well for him. His mouth dried. He closed it, trying to breathe silently. As he worked to appear nothing more than a rat in the walls, something brushed the back of his mind with inquiring, blood-stained fingertips. It was just like the touch at his doorway last night, the wordless command to let me in. But this felt smoother, stronger, more vibrant, like an Iznik tile set next to a child's pot. It caught in something, in his thoughts, like a fingernail snagging on fabric. Panicked, he brought a hand up, grabbed his text in its bead and pressed it to his forehead, silently reciting the names of God. The mental fingertips slipped, scrabbled for purchase, and couldn't find it. A cold thing slid past him like a breath. Then the two blood magicians, whatever they were, looked at one another, frowning. "Did you?" "I thought so, but no, nothing." The horse-faced woman rose and poured wine for all, as though she was the hostess. Not from the poisoned bottles, Zayd noticed. That remained hidden behind the cushions on the divan. She was lulling them into a false sense of security, perhaps, making them drunk and unobservant first. Zayd had quite revised his opinion of her poisoning attempt. Of course, she was right to try and get rid of these evil people. He should have known from the moment he saw her that she was an unwilling participant in all of this. A hostage, maybe, who should be rescued when the chance arrived. "Well, then," the one called Radu rubbed his forehead again, as if there was something sticky on it he couldn't quite scrub off. "If the campaign proper starts tonight, I suggest you and Mother take a bath. I have had fresh clothes laid out for you in your room." A bath? His mother, who did not look biologically old enough to be anything of the sort, licked her pink lips. "I think we'll take the clothes and go to the hammam. All those fat, naked Turks lying around, drowsy from the steam, flushed and parboiled. What could be more delightful?" She laughed and almost danced to the door. "I do like it here. I'm glad we came." When they had both gone through and shut the inner door behind them, Zayd wriggled out of his hiding place backwards, struggled down the wall, and went to fetch the army. The Korbachi of the local Janissaries lives not far from here. Unfamiliar with the neighbourhood of the harbour, Zayd had gone for help to the Harbour Master. Ubayd listened gravely, seeming to settle into the floor like a mound of couscous slowly slumping under its own weight. "We could send to him. But once the question is in the Janissaries' hands, there is no getting it out again. There would end your control of the situation, unless you wish to challenge a force that keeps the Sultan himself, may he live forever, in subjugation to their will." Zayd considered this advice with a mix of panic and despair. The Korbachi should at least be told to patrol the local bathhouses, to catch the monsters at their prey. He thought again about the miasma of guilt in the room, about the woman who seemed too good-natured to be doing this willingly, and the man who had sounded betrayed. "But you're right. The Janissaries would just kill them all, or throw them in the Seven Towers, and we would never find out what was really happening. But I can't take them on my own." "I have a little lock up here," Ubayd smiled, "to hold drunk sailors and dishonest warehousemen before I let them go or send them on to the Cadi to be judged. Bring them here. I'll give you a dozen strong men who answer to none but me. Once we have them behind bars, we can consider what must be done before we take the step of handing this over to the soup soldiers." He was as good as his word, sending a boy out to the local Janissary firefighters to ask them to check the local bathhouses. While Zayd impatiently drank coffee and fumed at his own inactivity, Ubayd assembled a force of cheerful amphibious men, half sailor, half wharf rat, armed with cudgels and marlin spikes. Zayd led them back to the foreigners' rooms, sending two by boat round via the door where he had entered. He had been given a brace of pistols by Ubayd, but felt so awkward with them, so inclined to shoot a comrade by mistake, that he stationed himself at the back of the group to keep well out of the way. The burly Armenian in front put his shoulder to the door, broke it down with a crash and a burst of splinters, and flung himself through, club in hand. The strangers had the gall to be surprised. He could hear their exclamations, even though he could see nothing around the flapping coats and broad shoulders of his escorts. Then came the sound of blows, smashing glass, and a woman's scream. Zayd pushed the last man in and followed, in time to see the urchin boy struck down as he tried to run for the rear exit. This had been far too easy. They had been interrupted at dinner. The floor was covered with the remnants of dishes, and it made Zayd sick to think that they could eat. A familiar bottle lay shattered, unopened by the side of the table. The golden-haired young man sprawled in a mess of soup, with blood running from his temple to the floor, limp as if in sleep. The dark-haired man was crouched, struggling to draw a sword, the scabbard of which was pinned under the foot of one of Zayd's helpers, while the boot of another man bore down on his neck. The urchin wriggled in the tight grip of a black-bearded Greek, and in the corner of the room the quiet woman stood against the wall. It was encouraging to see how even Zayd's rough brawlers could tell, instinctively, that she was not their enemy, not to be harmed. Fighting against the weight of his captor, the dark-haired man, Radu, could just barely hold his head up, but he still managed to glare. Zayd motioned to two of his men who were standing by the innocent woman, as if uncertain whether they were there to arrest or protect her. They had no such uncertainty over the man, but were quite willing to stamp on his fingers to make him let go of his sword, kick his supporting elbows out from under him, and force him properly to the floor. Zayd put his unneeded pistol back in his sash, and picked up his enemy's sabre. "Where are the other two? The White Lord and his wife?" Silence. "Make him sit up," Zayd commanded, and tried to tell himself he was entirely comfortable with the amount of violence with which his command was carried out. This man deserved to have his hair wrenched and his eye blacked and both of his shoulders forced back in a wrestling hold until they were all but dislocated. "Where are they?" he asked again, when the man was kneeling, tied tight with his own belt, his head drawn back by the hair, and a long wicked knife pressed to his throat, just hard enough to mark a seeping line. The prisoner grinned. "Nu inteleg, nu spun turka." Perhaps not. Zayd switched languages as easily as he might change a coat. "But I speak everything. Where are your companions, the White Lord and his wife?" The man mastered himself by degrees. His expression had already shifted from the naked emotion of a hunted thing fighting for its life to defensive humour. Now it regained the many-layered ironies of a nobleman's mask. His next smile was far more urbane. "I have no idea. They do not tell me of their plans. You should be glad they're not here. It would not go well for you if they were." Unhelpful, which was not surprising. Zayd decided to move the conversation to a place where there were more delicate implements for obtaining answers. He leaned down to hold his hand above the blond man's mouth. Mist collected on his fingertips as he registered how intently Radu was watching the gesture. Holding back a desire to ask if the man was alive? Well, let him wonder a little longer. "You two, bring this one and the boy. The lady must go to a woman's prison, but I don't think we need to bind her." The one they called Radu rearranged his expression to something more polite, verging on concerned. "May she have her eunuch?" Oh, so that was what the little urchin was doing in the household. He must be recently purchased, and not yet fitted out with clothes of splendour enough to match his mistress's. Zayd's intention to grill the boy about where he was from, to force him to strip to prove his gelding, did not survive a pleading look from the woman. She had nothing to do with this. Of course she should be permitted a companion to cheer and protect her. "Very well. Now come. You two, stay here. When the others return, bring them too." Sons of Devils, Chapter 16, in which everyone is lightly tortured, but Radu most of all. Frank awoke to what was becoming a very familiar pain in his head. The floor was gritty but cool beneath him, and for a while he had no resilience to do more than lie there and soak up the chill of a place that never saw the fierce Turkish sun. But he couldn't keep thought away forever. Eventually he had to struggle up, to open his eyes and face reality. Something clinked on the floor as he moved. When he tried to draw his legs under him, one was held back. He blinked open, blood-crusted eyes, and saw the iron locked around his foot, bruising his ankle when he moved it. The heavy chain stretched to a bolt deep in the stone wall. Light came into the room from a grilled square not large enough to put a head through, set in an iron-banded wooden door, at the bottom of which a rectangle of glowing stripes suggested a hatch for the pushing through of plates. A bucket sat within reach, empty but reeking from the soil of other prisoners that had seeped into its planks. 2 other bolts, ending in empty fetters, attached to the other walls, though the room was tiny enough that if they had both been occupied, there would not have been floor space for 3 prisoners to sit at once. Apart from these things, there was nothing, only stone. When he tried to stand, he found the roof was so low he had to bend double before he could straighten his legs. Perhaps the cells were stacked here like the pigeonholes of a desk, with one prisoner atop another like letters to be answered. When he tried to shake the door, it didn't even rattle in its socket, too heavy for him to move. Immediate reaction over, Frank swallowed, lowered himself back into the most convenient corner, and muttered one of Ekaterina's cantrips to soothe the pounding pain in his head. Where was Radu? Where were the girls? He had gone down quickly in the attack, taken by surprise before he'd been able to draw his sword, and had not seen what had befallen the others. As much as he wanted to tell himself it could not happen again, all his friends could not have been killed again, leaving him alone as the sole unworthy survivor, it could. It was all too possible that his curse had struck again, that he was left behind as a nemesis to the whole world, to anyone who had ever aided him. These were hopeless thoughts, but he could not shed them. It would have been better had there been other prisoners with him. Even if there had been an interrogation, torture, then his mind would have been occupied at least. As it was, they must have taken Radu for that, if he lived at all. And yes, perhaps he deserved it. But Frank would have pleaded for him if he could. He was trying to save me. He was trying to save his city. He was trying to save my country. All of that added up to it being Frank's fault. If Frank hadn't journeyed to Valchir, Radu would have kept the Strigoi in their own little pond, where they had to restrain themselves to a rhythm that all the humans around them could live with. An existence that was controlled, manageable, tolerable. He tried to rattle the door again, pressed his face to the grill and shouted, "Hello? Is there anyone there? I'll tell you everything. You don't need to hurt Radu. Talk to me. I'll tell you." Nothing to see outside the door. Only a blank stone wall across a narrow corridor. The light must be coming from somewhere, but he couldn't see where. Nor, if he turned his head, was anything visible on the other side of his cell, apart from another sliver of masonry. If there were other cells surrounding him, they were empty, because only silence answered his outbreak. His voice didn't even echo in the blank spaces. Closing his eyes, Frank tried to meditate, tried to lift up in cupped hands the blue-white power that had been inside him since his experience with the Vril accumulator. If he could but grasp it, he was sure he could shift himself out of this hole. He could shift this entire building out of existence, leave himself and the others sitting on pavement where a prison had been. It was like trying to catch a single pigeon in a town square. The power was a living thing that watched him. It let him get close. Then he lunged for it, and it burst up between his snatching hands, sometimes even brushing his face with its feathers, and was gone. 3 hours of this left him angry and starving, with the headache coming back. Terror for the others gnawed at him with such teeth that he barely had space for terror for himself. He only realised he was rocking back and forward when he leaned too far and smacked his forehead against the wall. Then frustration spilled out of him in a torrent of cursing. Useless! His friend, lover, was probably being tortured right at this very moment, and he could do nothing. He had killed his mother by being born. He had killed Gervase by loving him. He had killed Prothero and Stebbins by accepting their friendship and aid. Now he had killed Radu, and maybe even Istanbul itself, by not being decent enough to lie down and die when he was given the chance. No wonder the magic wouldn't come to him. Probably feared how many more deaths it would take before Frank would learn his lesson. Here he was sealed away and forgotten, powerless either to help or hurt anything ever again. His magic was wiser than he. It had already accepted that here was where it should stay. A fat man in brocaded yellow silk, with sweat-darkened stripes beneath his arms and down his back, was at that moment showing Radu the implements. Radu, whose wrists had been tied behind his back, and who had then been suspended from them for some hours, did his best to be unimpressed. For his jailer's safety, he was now shackled by cuffs locking his elbows and wrists behind him, and his feet were locked to a ball of iron twice the weight of a cannonball. Unimpressed was all he could do at present, in terms of inflicting damage on his enemies. This was a poky little room, no proper torture chamber. More like a storeroom hastily emptied of contraband wares. It smelled of cinnamon, without a trace of fear or blood. Shelves held a sparse collection of unpleasant things. A flail, a cat, a variety of thumbscrews and pears, pliers, saws and stretchers. There was room only for a scrubbed table that looked as if it had come from a kitchen, improvised leather straps hanging loosely on it. The whole business seemed very amateur, in comparison with the well-appointed dungeon Radu had at home. He flexed his shoulders against their restraints. Both of them were still in their sockets, though the muscles around them were torn to red rags. He was glad to find they moved yet, though the attempt made pain flood like a wash of strong acid down his back. The fat man spoke, genial and good-humoured, but for the knife-like glint in his eyes. The young man who had captured Radu earlier had gone quite pale beneath his tan, and his soft, serious eyes darted into the corners of the room as though afraid of rats. He licked his lips before translating. Ubayd says that he understands the surroundings are homely, but he wishes to reassure you that the man he has employed to use these implements is very skilled, and will more than make up for any smallness in appearance. I am grateful to him. Radu found it easier to carry on pretending this was all a game, when he knew he was less worried about the prospect of torture than his interrogator was. I am of royal blood. I expect the best. Ubayd chuckled a little, as if he had seen defiance before and it no longer impressed him. The translator fiddled with his turban, letting down a long tail of white fabric and holding it to his nose. He had a keen, hawk-like face and dark eyes full of thoughts. When he smoothed the fabric over his shoulders and looked up to translate, his long fingers trembled. There are, as you say, many ways to skin a cat, or a man. Rest assured we shall find one to suit. Ubayd opened the door and summoned in Radu's guards. This, Radu assumed, was the point at which they would take him back to his cell and allow him to stew for a while in his fear, give him time to think about what the devices would feel like on his flesh. He knew this game too, but it didn't stop it from working. Father of all, Lord omnipotent, I am not worthy to pray to you, but help me now in the hour of my need. Help me to endure, as so many others of my countrymen have had to endure, and forgive me. Forgive me for bringing this on us all. The leash of the ball attached to his leg was too short to allow him to pick it up and straighten, but if he tried to tug it behind him, limping, it rolled forward with each step and struck him in the heels, an incessant jabbing, battering pain. He crouched down to lift it as far as he could, to sidle crab-like back out into the corridor. One of the guards smacked him across the fingers with a sharp cane. Pain, hot like boiling water, spilled on his hands. He didn't drop it, and so they hit him again and again until the mechanical strength of his fingers failed, and he did. Then someone hit him in the back, right between his torn and throbbing shoulders, made him lurch forward into the door jamb. The ball rolled after him to clip him in the ankles and staggered him again with the impact of iron against bone. He was proud of how calmly he had taken all of this, until they laughed. Then seething hatred boiled through his veins like hot oil. He lowered his head, drove it into the nearest guard's belly, and laughed in return when the man heaved for breath, doubled over and whooping. A staggering blow across Radu's right cheek filled his world with white stars, but left the guard's hand close enough to bite. He raised his head, almost enjoying this now, his blood roaring with something better than fear, sank his teeth deep into the ball of the guard's thumb and ground them together. Maybe he could provoke them into killing him. "Wait!" The scholarly young man laid a restraining hand on the guard's chest. He was of a similar sort of build to Frank. Don't think of Frank. A greyhound of a man, all bones and elegance. He couldn't have held back such a brute as the guard by strength, but the man stopped anyway, chastened. Authority, then, was the power this young man wielded. He didn't look like anyone special, white turban, dove-grey clothes of heavy linen. But he had been the intelligence behind Radu's capture, and he was now the authority to whom his tormentors answered. He caught Radu's gaze with a look that was complicated and wary and a little sickened, his stomach not strong enough for the task he'd taken on. "I can work with that." Radu's mouth, still clamped tight around the guard's tugging hand, was full of blood. It flowed hot and stinking between his teeth. He unlocked his jaw, spat the blood out on the floor in front of him, and watched to find out what this unexpected gentleman would do next. Even if nothing came of the man's intervention, the pause, a breathing space to pull himself back together, to master all the pains and tell himself they were not so bad, was very welcome. "This is not working." The young man rubbed his fingers together, curled them around the rough pottery pendant he wore on a silver chain around his neck. To the winded guard, who had now recovered enough to stand, he said, "Bring me a lighter ball and chain. I want him able to stand up." He turned back to Radu with a sigh. "As for you, it seems to me that if I let them torture you, you will only think yourself justified in what you've done." "Perhaps," his voice lightened, as if he would like to allow himself to believe what he was about to say. "Perhaps you don't even know yourself. You have been inside since you arrived, and I recall that you were already having some doubts. You and I should go for a little walk. I have something I want you to see." Even with the lighter ball, it was still all but impossible for Radu to walk more than 4 steps at a time. Although he could lift this one in one pinioned hand, the weight on his abused shoulders was enough to throw his back into spasms and make his ribs burn as though his heart was bursting. After 4 paces he had to let it fall, breathe and collect himself before he could pick it up with the other hand and repeat the process. This frustrated everyone so much that, before they had even made it out of the prison corridor, his captors had decided just to hobble his ankles together and leave off the weight. Instead, he was bolted into a slave collar, its chain held by a guard with a drawn sword, who flanked him on the left. Behind them, a second guard, the one he had bitten, followed at a distance with a primed pistol, and his guide took great care to be beyond the reach of a desperate lunge. Outside, another clear, hot day was dawning, and though he knew he had been left to stew in guilt and agony for hours, he hadn't realized he had spent an entire night in his windowless cell. He'd been trying not to think of the others, of what could have happened to the women, of whether Frank was alive or... But his interrogator had decided on kindness as a more effective strategy than torment. So it couldn't hurt, surely, just to ask. "What's your name?" They shoved him into a boat and rowed him under Byzantine curves through a culvert that emerged in the harbour, through an opening shaggy with weed. He thought of empty warehouses fitted up for torture on the spur of the moment. Thought of his captors, bully boys, dressed more like common sailors than Janissary soldiers. And he wondered with some small hope exactly how official his captivity was. Did the Sultan know? Or any of his officials? Seated rather primly in the bows as he was, the young man looked surprised to be asked. "Zayd ibn Rahman." He paused a moment and then offered, "I am the Padishah's archmage. May he live forever." Oh. That had been said tentatively, as though it was a lie or something he scarcely believed himself. A new appointment. Or just another man like Frank, whom magic had filled with doubts and emptiness. Radu thought it was not a lie. It explained the vague unpreparedness of the man's eyes, his soft heart, and his power all in one handful. "Tell me, Zayd, does my companion still live?" "Do you deserve to know the answer to that question?" They passed a wharfside house, where a shrouded bundle in the shape of a corpse lay halfway up the quay steps. When the guards tied up the boat to come up from the waterway and enter the city on the Pera side, they had to step over the corpse. "It's not a case of deserving. It's a matter of whether we can talk or not. If you've killed him—" Zayd had light, smoky amber eyes and strong black brows that pinched together with distaste at the thought. "He is not dead." Radu smiled at him graciously, made smug by relief. "I am still a warrior, still a boyar, indomitable by this or earlier empires, older and more certain than this boy, the ink of his job description still wet on the page. Then, perhaps, I will listen to what you have to say." They marched him across the square, and into the first mosque they came across, up the tight double spiral of one of the minarets, and out onto the balcony from which the call to prayer was sung. At the top, it took Radu a long while of frozen stillness, trying not to pant too loudly, nor to grimace too obviously from the sting of his many wounds, before he had any attentiveness over to spare for what he was supposed to be looking at. But Zayd stood patiently while he gathered himself, and did not mock. The kindness was unsettling. "Look," the Archmage said at last, and with a flat hand he made a sweep from horizon to horizon. Radu would have said, "Very pretty," if he had been altogether in command of himself, because the view of Istanbul was fine, with the harbour glimmering on one side of him, and the great palaces of the envoys of every nation standing up amid cypresses on the far side of it, white stone and flower beds pinked by morning light. On this side, crooked streets wound up into more parklands. Mosques and palaces, greater than anything at home, were shaped like distant clouds and glittering with gold. But Radu had also seen what he had been brought here to see. Corpses in all the streets, processions of mourners, the courtyards of the mosques filled up with the dead. The heartbroken cries of the living rose up to him from the ground as though he stood above hell itself. Here came a father with a child dead in his arms. The father's face was silver with tears and the child's as white as snow. He was intercepted by the imam, and Radu watched them argue, the boy's head lolling between them as his father twitched with agony and denial. "What?" He had to clear his throat. It had closed up tight. "What is the argument about?" "How am I to know?" Zayd replied, quiet but angry. Perhaps he asks why the holy men have not protected his son from this, why Allah has allowed it. Or perhaps he has seen the heaps of the dead who must be buried today, and wants to know that his child will not be left to wait. From here it was as though Istanbul was a kicked-over ant-hill. The dead lay thick and white as ant larvae over all the ground. As they watched, companies of soldiers had begun to go from house to house, dragging out whole households of corpses into the streets. Radu had once been in the mountains, picking his way across the base of a slope of scree, when he heard a single stone crack in the cold above him. Some instinct had raised the hair on his head and made him bound for the trees like a goat, narrowly escaping the fall of the whole slope. Now he had that same sense of avalanche. Suppose one Strigoi fed on 10 people in a night. The next night there would be 100 victims, and the night after that 1,000. God, it was appalling. The magnitude of it. The death throes of an entire country. It was... "You are our allies, our own people," Zayd was speaking such nonsense it took a while for Radu to understand it. "You live within the habitation of peace, under the wise and kind guidance of our own Sultan. For hundreds of years you've been part of this empire, your beliefs and freedoms protected by our laws. How could you betray us like this?" Was that really what the Ottomans thought? How perverse. The absurdity of the claim took the edge from the overwhelming horror which had begun to lift the floor under which he kept it, to seep out into plain sight. He turned on the little fool with contempt. "Has it not occurred to you from the many times you have had to march your armies against us and take us by force that we don't want to be part of your empire? We don't want your peace, your laws. We don't want you stealing our children to be slaves, using us as cannon fodder in your wars, martyring our princes and taxing our peasants into famine." Better. Pity had been in the process of unmanning him. Better the red rage and the desire to tear his enemy's throat out with his teeth. "Yes, this is my doing. I brought this against you. Why should I be ashamed? Your people have sucked the blood from mine for 500 years. It is no more than you deserve." Zayd recoiled, as if he was in the presence of monstrosity, the odd, soft innocence in him a reproach in itself. He retreated until his back was to the closed door, and Radu felt a high, exultant delight in the shock and terror on his face. After a night in chains and pain, it was wonderful to feel powerful again. But Zayd stopped his retreat, flattened his hands against the aged wood of the door as if to draw in its strength, and his expression shifted from fear to abhorrence. "This is how Christians wage war. Your God of mercy, he would be pleased with this, would he?" It was as though Zayd had rammed a pick straight into the centre of Radu's chest. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Sure he would die as his ribs broke under the sudden impact. Years and years of anguish and horror and carefully cultivated denial, and now his lungs were failing because he was feeling it all at once. Below them, the father laid down his child at the end of one of the long lines of corpses, drew a fold of shroud over the boy's face, and knelt beside him, rocking slightly as he keened. Radu covered his own face and shook, speechless as a lifetime's habit of ignoring the depths failed him catastrophically, because he had concentrated on the surfaces of things. The abominations in the depths had been allowed to thrive. Now they had broken the glass under which he kept them and were climbing out, visible at last. The boy in the streets down there, Stefan, the girls his father had collected for him and who he had allowed to be destroyed in return. He blessed Mirella for surviving and desperately wanted her with him. He wanted Ekaterina and Frank, those few people he had managed to save, so that he could gather them in his arms and say, "Look, I tried. I kept my staff safe, all my servants, my own people, I kept them safe. Mostly. I saved their souls, I made sure they were burnt after." A shove in the back belonged to a different world, one almost irrelevant to this place of terrible truth. He obeyed it without thought, allowing himself to be herded back down the steps. As they returned him to his cell, he was too distracted even to escape. He had expected to die under torture, like the other Wallachian martyrs. True, it wasn't a prospect he had relished, but he would at least have known that he'd won. This, though, the understanding only got worse as his mental eyes adjusted to the light. Being allowed to live with this whole universe of condemnation inserted into his head. No, he couldn't do it. It was unbearable. Torture would be better. Thanks for listening. That was Sons of Devils, read by Galadir. The music was Gifts of Stars by Lloyd Rogers. Join us next week to see how Zayd and Ubayd take Radu's change of heart. See you there.